there's this misconception that if you're not a subject matter expert, that you can't create good learning on a topic. And that is something that I've had to prove wrong time and time again. While you definitely rely heavily on SMEs, they, you can still craft very, very strong learning experiences. And you don't have to have, say, sales experience to create a really good, strong sales training, for example.
Is organizations a lot of times will seek training for something when really what they're seeking is a best practice or a procedure for something. I remember once I worked at an organization where they kept coming to the learning and development team asking for sales training. And we kept asking, like, well, what's the sales philosophy at this company? How do you do consultative sales? What's the process? What do we do to overcome objections? And the response was like, I don't know, the training will figure it out.
Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Visual Lounge. We've got two fantastic guests with us today, Sara Sorenson, Tim Slade. Sara and Tim, welcome. We're going to have you introduce yourselves real quick. Tim will ask you to go first, and then Sara, you'll just follow. Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Matt. I'm Tim. I run the eLearning Designers Academy, which is a free community and platform for new instructional designers and eLearning developers. And that's me.
Perfect. And how about you, Sara?
Hi, I'm Sara, and I am the manager of product enablement for a company called Muck Rack. We're a software as a service company that serves PR professionals, and we also offer free tools to journalists as well. And I've been doing instructional design for several years, started in a call center, and now work over at Muck Rack. So I'm very excited to chat with you today.
Yeah. Well, we're so glad that you're both here. Tim's you're a veteran to the show. Sara, this is your first time. Welcome to the fray here. It should be fun. As we go through our questions today, guys, feel free to, we want this to be lively. If you're listening at home, hey, think about what questions you've got. Maybe send them via email or chat with us or whatever. We're going to be talking about what people get wrong about learning. And there's three pillars here. There's kind of the organization, there's the learners, and I think then there's L&D or people who are in those training type roles. So let's start with organizations. Obviously there's a lot organizations feel there's some things they're compelled to do. There's things that they're trying to do because they want to be good stewards. And then there's things that they're doing because, they got motives and other hopefully opportunities they want to improve. But for you guys, what's the big first thing you think organizations are getting wrong right now about learning? Any thoughts?
I mean, I think when we think about I've been doing a lot of writing lately about the function of instructional design as it relates to how it fits within the organization and how it relates to the business and how it relates to the learner. And at least from my experience, I think the thing that most organizations get wrong about learning is that it's not really the organization, but it's really the subject matter experts that you're working with. And I think we all have a common understanding that, our goal here is to hopefully help the business operate better through increasing employee performance. But I think the thing that gets in the way a lot of times is the subject matter experts that we work with. They're almost swimming too much in their own SME-ness to differentiate that our learners or their learners or our target audience don't need to be as knowledgeable or as passionate or as capable as they are in their thing as the learners really need to be in order to get the job done. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does. So let's talk about SMEs for a second, because I do think, every organization's got them. We try to use them, sometimes poorly, sometimes people are able to use them well. Sara, have you seen anything where we're making mistakes here in this topic?
Absolutely. I think one of the most common misconceptions that orgs have is that you simply have to be knowledgeable to be able to teach others. And I think anyone in our position knows that that is not always the case. I've had to sit through some trainings where, the person, if you've ever sat through a training with an engineer or a mechanic, it can be a bit painful sometimes. They're very knowledgeable about what they do, but they don't always know the best way to convey that knowledge and to do it in a way that is relevant to the learner. And that's really where the expertise of L&D professionals comes in. So, and also there's this misconception that if you're not a subject matter expert, that you can't create good learning on a topic. And that is something that I've had to prove wrong time and time again. While you definitely rely heavily on SMEs, they, you can still craft very, very strong learning experiences. And you don't have to have, say, sales experience to create a really good, strong sales training, for example.
Yeah. I think it's that conflating knowledge versus ability, and if we just keep pumping them with more information, somehow that's going to result in more capability and then maybe some more passion about whatever the thing is. When in reality, that's it just doesn't add up that way.
Well, let me ask you this because, I totally agree with both what you guys are saying. But so, from an organizational standpoint, if you got to be CEO of the world and you're trying to dictate to your organization, like you get to say like, hey, this is how we're going to use SMEs. What should that look like? Because I think the thing is, I hear complaints all the time about, a SME will give you like, you're like, hey, put together a slide deck, and it's like 100 slides of information. To your point, Tim, that no one else is passionate about, nobody needs to really know, no one cares about, but like, what's the reality of what that relationship should look like to make maybe the biggest impact in terms of going from someone who's got this expertise and knowledge to be able to convey whatever portion of that is needed to someone who is not an expert, who just needs to know, some, for those who are just listening, I'm making a very small gesture with my fingers, but maybe it's a little bit more than that, right? Maybe they need to know some amount, right? Any thoughts?
Where I've found it most valuable to have SMEs involved is generally during like an analysis to understand what people actually do need to know. And that can be very helpful in also curbing some of that info dump that tends to happen with SMEs, where they want to share everything that they know about a topic. So doing like a job task analysis kind of approach, but having them sit through that with you and help you walk through that is really valuable. And then of course I always involve SMEs in like the final review. I need them to review things to make sure they're accurate, and that I am not teaching the wrong thing or interpreting something incorrectly. So I see them as very collaborative and consultative, and that's usually the best position. And then occasionally it's great to involve SMEs in, like follow-up sessions like Q&As or office hours type things. That is where they really shine, when people come in with questions. And sometimes that can alleviate their trepidation to leave information out. If you say, well, we'd love to do a follow-up where if anyone does have remaining questions, they get to ask you as an expert. So sorry, Tim, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No. You made a great point about how where SMEs really shine is during like, a social learning type of event and like a Q&A or an office hours. And I think that's one area where I think we, as an L&D function in our organizations, could do a better job of is when we think about the tribal knowledge that a lot of subject matter experts have, that it's, even though we can't just take it and put it on some slides and add a next button and dump it into all of our learners' brains all at once, it doesn't mean that information isn't valuable. It's just about when is it most valuable to our learners, and how do we make it the most effective and efficient way for our learners to access that information. And so I think what we could be doing a better job of is utilizing our SMEs outside of the formal training that we're creating, and maybe there's more informal training through those Q&As or through those events or some sort of social learning, whether it's a Slack channel or a discussion board or something like that, where those SMEs are given the opportunity to be what they are, a subject matter expert, where they don't feel like their only outlet to do that is by stuffing it all into an e-learning course. Because I think that's what ultimately happens, is they don't feel like they have any other outlet to provide their knowledge. So then it just gets stuffed into an e-learning course. And then when we fight against that, then they just go rogue and create their own training anyhow. And so I think there's ways that we can invite them into the learning in different ways. So we're kind of honoring that and making them feel like they're part of it. Does that make any sense?
Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense, and I appreciate that perspective that like these folks have stuff that they want to share. They are passionate and excited. I remember doing creating a course about of all things water purification, and there was one guy at this plant that knew everything about water purification. Like he knew the whole system. But he was the one person that knew start to finish, and the goal was to get him into some other opportunities. And so he was very passionate about all those steps and processes, and there was some amount that he needed to be able to transfer. But yeah, other people, that if that's his only outlet is this one training, gosh, that's going to be problematic, right? So yeah, I appreciate that, and I appreciate the thought of the social. I love that idea actually of like, hey, here's the training, but we know you're going to have questions. We know there's going to be follow up, so let's make that available to other people.
Real
Oh,
quickly
good.
before
No,
we
please.
transition out, the other thing too, I think organizations get wrong. This just dawned on me, and I've seen this many times before. Is organizations a lot of times will seek training for something when really what they're seeking is a best practice or a procedure for something. I remember once I worked at an organization where they kept coming to the learning and development team asking for sales training. And we kept asking, like, well, what's the sales philosophy at this company? How do you do consultative sales? What's the process? What do we do to overcome objections? And the response was like, I don't know, the training will figure it out. And we had to keep explaining to them, like, no, that the training does not set the sales philosophy at this organization. We're training to your sales philosophy, but you have to define what that is. And so I think a lot of times the thing that organizations get wrong is they seek training when in reality, a lot of times they need to set standards first before we figure out how to train to those standards.
Hard agree. I've definitely seen the same at pretty much every organization I've worked in this kind of role. It's a very common thing and misconception to have, and yeah, it is hard sometimes to have to combat that a little bit and teach a little of, yeah, we shouldn't be the ones making decisions on process for the business necessarily. We are not the process experts. We are there to help, you know, with behavior change and learning. So, yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I have one more thing to add to that. I remember recently I was having a conversation with somebody and they were asking, how do we determine KPIs for the training that we're delivering, or how do we determine how we measure the training that we're delivering? And I had this epiphany recently where I came to the conclusion it is not our job as learning and development people to determine how the organization measures successive performance for their employees. Our subject matter experts and our stakeholders have to tell us how do they measure success of their employee performance, and then we use that to measure our training against those things, right? And so I think a lot of times the thing that organizations get wrong, and a lot of the things L&D gets wrong, is we take on responsibility for things that really is the responsibility of the organization. It is not our job to determine how the organization measures success. Our job is to create training that hopefully moves the needle for however they measure success.
Yeah, I think a great example, an interview I did with Bob Pike, a long time ago, he talked about like if an organization wants to cut waste, right? The training or whatever your intervention you're creating should show that we've cut waste. Like it's the outcome of that we want, like in whether you're teaching them through a video or a slide or in-person thing, whatever, the result is cutting waste. And so you've got 50% waste or 25% less waste or whatever. And so that I think that ties to that. And I do think what you both have said, it's really about the looking at the whole system and saying training is not an answer for every problem in the organization, right? Sometimes it is other interventions. Sounds like in a sales department needed some like philosophy intervention of like, hey, what is our approach? They needed a fundamental approach. So, well, let's keep going here because I think we could put a lot on the organization, but I think systemically organizations are what they are, but they're made up of people. They're also made up of learners. So, are there things that we're seeing our learners getting wrong about the process of learning? I think there's a lot of things that we do that probably enable them, but they probably do a lot of things to maybe work against themselves even. Any thoughts?
That's a hard one. I have a hard time, I don't want to say assigning blame, but looking for areas of opportunity for what learners can be doing differently or better, because so many of the issues don't stem from what the learner is or isn't doing, but what we're doing wrong as it relates to how the organization's operating or how L&D is operating in order to deliver that training. And then are we talking about an hourly person working at a coffee shop? Are we talking about, a seasoned professional who's working at the executive level, right? I think the higher up you move, up that chain at whatever organization you're at, and the more you're an experienced professional, I think there's a reasonable expectation that you as the learner or you as the professional need to be taking more ownership and direction over your learning needs and how you go about advocating for them and obtaining them. So if I were to assign any sort of thing that I think learners get wrong, it's that the more advanced you move into your career or into your, up that chain, the less you can just rely on what the L&D team is pushing out. They might make things available to you, learning libraries and or whatnot, but I think there's a reasonable expectation that you need to be taking more an active role in pursuing those opportunities.
Yeah, and I will be clear. I appreciate what you said there, Tim, and I want to be clear. This is less of a blame to the learners and
Sure.
more that just like I think sometimes, from my perspective, learners we've been taught in certain ways, and we get kind of stuck in our box, and
Mm.
that we're not willing to get out of that and say like, oh, that's a learning opportunity, or that's a learning opportunity, or we prescribe to it. And I'm guilty of this as anyone. Sometimes I prescribe a thought to it, like, oh, that's not really that valuable. That's not really for me. And I'll tell you what, learning professionals who are learners, we are the worst.
Yeah, horrible.
Yes.
So maybe that's the lens I'm looking at, is like, I'm a terrible learner at times because I know how good learning should be, and this isn't it. And that's such a false dichotomy, right? Like I should be able to learn from whatever's put out there, even if it's not designed 100% as the best thing ever. Like a lot of that's on me taking initiative to learn. So again, not blaming people as much as like
Yeah.
just kind of turning the lens a little bit and saying like, hey, how could we get a little bit better? But Sara, any thoughts on this topic of, are things that you're seeing your learners or other learners maybe could be thinking about or doing a little bit differently?
Yeah, I think a lot of what learners get wrong about learning, it's, a result of a lot of environmental factors, but I think it requires a bit of a mindset adjustment. So I one big one that I thought of with this question is I see a lot of folks who have this idea that if I'm not enjoying a learning experience, it must be bad learning, or if it's not engaging, which is why a lot of folks tend to rate things like video or e-learning a little bit higher than other things, but that isn't necessarily aligned with what's actually bringing them the most value. Um, and they may think that it's not worth their time. So it's interesting to look at some of the data and the perceptions and all of that. The truth is, the most helpful learning isn't always the flashiest. Sometimes it's just a boring old table and a help doc that gives you just exactly what you need to get the job done. And then there's obviously the common myth of learning styles, which any instructional design person or L&D person who just heard me say that probably groaned. Which is, and I think learners still buy into this more so than anyone else. That, oh, I'm a visual learner, so I can only learn from video, or I'm an auditory learner, I prefer podcasts or whatever. But in reality, the research shows tailoring content to the style of someone's preferred learning doesn't actually improve their learning outcomes, and it's more effective to match the format to the task that you're trying to do. So, obviously, if you're trying to learn to do something in a software tool like Muck Rack, You could learn via video, but a step-by-step article or even a checklist might be way more useful than a polished, fun, animated video. And I do both, and I enjoy doing both, but I am very aware that, one tends to be more effective than the other. Um, and as I like to say, simple beats sexy every time. And I know that like gamification and e-learning and video can be sexy, but yeah, sometimes simpler is better.
It's so
I
hard that.
oh,
Oh,
go ahead,
go ahead,
Tim.
Matt.
No, I was just gonna say I love that simple over sexy. I think that works really well. Go ahead, Tim.
It's so hard to have this conversation and not point the have a conversation about like all of those things are issues that I think L&D people really get wrong, and I know we're going to get there soon. But I think to your point, Sarah, a lot of learner. I think a lot of times when we go into a workplace environment and we approach workplace learning, we bring all of our past experiences of learning through K through 12 and through college to our work, and then we kind of expect a similar learning experience, when in reality, like, that's not what you're going to get. You're not going to get graded work and assignments and lectures. I mean, sometimes you do, and that's awful. And so I think it's the thing that learners get wrong about learning is that learning looks different in a workplace environment or a performance environment, or even with customer education, looks very different when you're learning a new tool versus when you were learning something back at school, right? And so I think if there's one thing that I think learners could do differently, and this ties into I think the organization and L&D, is embracing failure along the way and realizing that learning is happening in ways that we don't even call learning. Sometimes you having to go find the answer for yourself and figure it out. That's part of the learning process, and that's learning, even if it didn't come as the sexy video that was assigned to you in the learning management system.
I've done off camera, but just shaking my head. Yes, right. Like I totally agree. I think the expectations from my formative years, college years, grad school into a workplace are very different experiences, and they should be. But I think, yeah, I so 100% agreement that I think there's a little bit of expectation setting that maybe we could do better at.
And I think the thing that prevents us from doing that is something happens when you move out of like kindergarten and K through 12 and you start moving into high school and college and then into the workforce. We stigmatize mistakes. Like, it's the failure is the worst thing ever. And so then how does that affect our ability to learn when we don't feel safe to take risks or make mistakes in whatever it is that we're trying to figure out how to do?
Yeah, that's exactly the other big misconception I was going to speak to is this failure is, means I'm not learning, right? When in
Mm-hmm.
actuality, failure is such a good way to learn. One of the big things I see, especially with adult learners, is, that belief if I'm getting it wrong, it means I'm not learning. Or if I miss a question, well, clearly I'm not getting it. Or, people often call it a gotcha question, like it's just designed to punish you. When in actuality, those kinds of experiences and questions and things are incredibly valuable. There's this concept referred to as desirable difficulties. It comes from like Robert and Elizabeth Bjork. And it's just this basic idea that when your brain has to struggle a little to retrieve or guess an answer, or if you get it wrong, you're actually more likely to remember that later. And that can be incredibly valuable. And there's a lot of really solid science behind that. But when I'm building knowledge checks or informal assessments, we do like a monthly product updates call. We actually just did it earlier today for our internal teams, and we like to do like a Kahoot and things like that. And I'm known. I get teased at work a lot for having a trick question, at least one every time. And I always tell folks, I'm not trying to evaluate you. I am trying to help you learn and remember the most important things from this experience. And I will argue that you are going to remember it, because I have people who will message me days later like, you got me with that one. So yeah, I think it's managing your expectations that learning doesn't have to be formal, which I think ties back to what you said, Tim, about, the way we're exposed to learning through school years and college. I think a lot of people forget that learning can happen anytime, anywhere, and that failure is often one of the most valuable parts of the learning experience.
Yeah.
So let me ask you guys this question, because as you guys have been going through this, I've been thinking about, okay, all great to talk about, great for us to lay that out, right? Like, I think we've hit on something here that's really interesting. How as L&D professionals, we'll give ourselves the credibility enough to say that we can call ourselves that. But thinking about our peers out there, for anyone who's listening to this, how do we help the learners to get to that point? Because Sarah, and I love that you're doing like the Kahoot with those things. You're laying it out there. I'll have to look up. You said it was Robert and Elizabeth Bjork. Is that right?
Yes.
I'll have to look that up. Desirable difficulty. So how do we help learners get to that point of failure? And I think this is probably one of the areas, because we got to talk about it now. L&D, we're guilty here. It's not just the organization. It's not just the learners. There's a lot on us. So, but first, how do we get to help our learners feel comfortable with that it's okay to get things wrong? Because look, I've got kids that are in college. I got one, he's like, I'm going to get my first B in college, like, ever. And he's like devastated, like not really devastated, but he's pretty devastated by it, right? But so how do we help him transition, or others transition, the fact that it's okay to make some mistakes, get some things wrong, and still know that learning is happening?
I think we have to build that into the training experiences that the training experiences we design, and we need to advocate to not the learners that it's okay to fail, but to our subject matter experts and stakeholders that the experience of transforming that learner from point A to point B is going to take time, and it's more than them just completing the training that we delivered. I remember I worked at an organization once where we would actively build in time beyond the formal training event. It was like a 3-week period where they would practice the thing that we taught them, and it was during that period they would move from, performing at whatever level to getting to the desired level of performance, because it wasn't just an immediate leap from completing the e-learning course or the training to now performing at the expected level. It was a period of time, right? So there was still accountability of, are you on track to your desired level of performance, but knowing that that was going to be a process of time, not just an immediate turnaround. And so I think it really isn't. I think it has to start with the culture that we encourage with the people who are leading our learners.
I would agree with that, but I would say, there is something to be said to help the learner understand, because there is a lot of anxiety for folks. People get test
Mm.
anxiety, or because motivation is so important, and you don't want folks to get discouraged right off the bat. So even if just in your learning experience, like for example with my call, I like to say, like, remember the points don't matter, like this is to help
Mm.
you learn, or to help you see what sticks and what doesn't. Sometimes just providing that psychological safety with, like, a little preface, it can go a really, really long way at just level setting those expectations and avoiding the anxiety, especially, like, if I'm someone who's taking like an asynchronous e-learning course. If that isn't there, I don't know if it's going to come back to me that I did so poorly on this knowledge check, and I'm going to get in trouble somehow, or I'm going to fail the course, and I'm going to have to retake it. So, like, sometimes it is nice to just have that little bit of reassurance that, oh, it's okay if I get this wrong now. It's part of it. But I agree with everything you said as well, Tim, that it goes
Yeah.
beyond just that. It's so much more involved, and you do have to champion that realistic, timeline often. A lot of folks will think if people perform poorly at the end of a formal learning event, that they aren't going to perform well outside of it, and that's not always the case. And
Mm.
so that is a big obstacle we have to overcome in L&D, is helping a lot of stakeholders beyond our department understand that. So yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you guys are going to probably find this hard to believe, but we are running up on time already. So I want to make sure we're getting a few more of the L&D hits in there in terms of like, hey, let's keep us grounded, let's keep us humble. Let's go kind of speed round style where quick opportunities that we've talked about, I think, some really great things. We've talked about the organization, we've talked about the learners, we just kind of started getting to what our L&D group's doing wrong. What else are we doing that we think like, gosh, we could be doing better in this area to help our learners to actually get to the end outcomes that we're trying to achieve? So
I have two quick ones. My two would be like we as L&D people need to be. Heidi Kirby recently posted about this on LinkedIn. We need to stop being selfish designers and making things shiny and flashy because we think it's cool. It doesn't mean that our learners are going to think it's cool, and it doesn't mean it's effective, right? So, Matt, I always harp on like we don't need a talking head avatar in every e-learning course. It doesn't make it more effective. So, like I think we need to be less selfish designers in that sense. That not everything has to be shiny and flashy. And then I think the other thing that we need to be a better job of is I have this phrase that I use called fit for function, right? So like our goal isn't to create the most complex thing possible. Our goal is to create the simplest thing possible that will achieve the desired result. And so there's all sorts of crazy things that we can create and do, but if we can do it, much simpler, if it's all it requires is a job aid or a document or something like that, or an email even, that could still be learning and training. It just doesn't have to be a full-blown production in order to get it done. So those would be my two.
Awesome. Love
Yeah.
it.
One of mine kind of piggybacks off of that latter one you said, Tim, which is I think we do a disservice to our learners when we treat supplemental resources as an afterthought.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we get so focused on like the formal learning event that we just focus all our attention on that first and foremost, and we tend to try to then fit any supplemental resources around what we already have planned out or even already developed for a formal training, when it is usually so much more effective to do the opposite. And you have to think about what are learners really going to use the most. Like they're really going to rely so heavily when they're on the job on or whatever the situation is, with those supplemental resources, those quick references, maybe FAQs, whatever it is. And if you don't plan those out strategically and you know create them in a way that is optimized, rather than just kind of throwing them into whatever your internal knowledge base is in whatever format, if you don't optimize those and really think through what's going to be most impactful in the moment when I come to need this or need to apply this knowledge, then you could have the best, most flashy, formal learning experience, and it would be all for naught. So I think that's one of the most common ones. And the other one I would say, which also is related, is we tend to jump to a modality or a deliverable before we have all the facts. So sometimes we think, or we rely a little bit too much on assumptions, or what's worked in the past. And sometimes you really do need to take a step back and evaluate and analyze the situation and do a formal analysis and let that guide you, rather than we have a tendency, especially if you're particularly creative, to have so many ideas that we get excited about, but at the end of the day that may not actually be that effective or what's needed. And I liked what you said, Tim, about we need to figure out what's the simplest thing that we can do to achieve that desired result. So
Yeah, I got one more too, Sarah. So this one, my last hot button issue on this is I wish we would stop doing training request forms in L&D, because I see people all the time going, I have a training request form and my subject matter experts keep requesting training when training's not the answer. And I'm like, you can't make a drive-through and have them order hamburgers and then get upset when you handed them a kale salad when they come pick up their food, right? Like, so that's my whole thing is like stop with the training request forms, because you're setting yourself up for being treated like an order taker if that's what you're creating for yourself is an order form.
I, well,
that's a
I
good
I love these analogies. Perfect. So go ahead, Sara.
I was going to say, that's a good hot take. I slightly disagree because I do
That's
see a
okay.
need for some more formal intake, because Lord knows I've gotten so many informal requests scattered throughout Slack. So if you have like a team that you're working with, there's a lot to be said for being able to funnel those requests. But certainly, I love the analogy, Tim. But you do have to set the expectation that just because someone's submitting something on a request form doesn't mean that's what they're going to get, and it doesn't mean
Yeah.
they're going to get anything necessarily. It also requires you to have like an actual, you have to do an analysis and put your expertise on it and determine whether or not that is a need, and if it is a need, what's the priority,
Mhm.
because yeah, no, I agree, and then like that's like caveat, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a branding issue, right? Having an intake process and then having a training request form, it's like two different things, I think.
True. Yeah, you
Yeah.
shouldn't have one without the other.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, I'm going to wrap us to conclusion here, but I did want to say I had a thought about this whole learner, this journey L&D, what's getting wrong. One thing I've been thinking about a lot is that I think sometimes as L&D professionals, we forget how hard learning is. That it is a process. It takes time. We often, I think, go in with this expectation that one and done is going to do it. And sometimes that's because we have time to create and do. But I've noticed within myself, especially, things are getting harder to learn. It takes me a little longer, I'm getting a little older here, whatever it might be. But like that, I need dedicated time to really focus on something, because otherwise I'm also noticing I've got 10,000 things I need to do. And so I think one thing I'd say is, as those learnings coming in, remember, have some empathy for the learner, that this might be really hard, that this might be out of their comfort zone, or it might need a little bit more just space to really absorb it than we often give. And as someone who makes a ton of videos, sometimes a video is great, and sometimes I still need another double the time of the video to be able to be like, oh yeah, and not just watch it, but to maybe to maybe think, to process. So that would be my thing is, I don't know that we as organizations or learning professionals are off, or even as a learner, are taking the time. Sometimes I think we should, for better outcomes, because it's like, just get through it, get it done. And I get that mentality, but it's hard. So. Well, with that said, Sara, Tim, thank you so much, both of you, for joining me here in the Visual Lounge.
Yeah.
Thanks for
Thank you for
having
having
us.
us.
Yeah, you bet. So, you guys, first of all, everyone should go find Tim, his eLearning Academy. Sara, I'm assuming connect on LinkedIn, go find Muck
Yeah.
Rack, see some of your work over there, get some great examples of customer education. But, we'll link to you guys in all the stuff down below in the description. So if anyone wants to connect to you, that can happen. With that said, I'm just going to wrap up the show. Normally I have my camera's all messed up, so I'm just going to do it from here. You guys get to be on screen the whole time, just staring like, what are we going to do now? Is this that we here at the Visual Lounge, of course, we're always looking at ways, how do we get better? How do we make learning that works? How do we use video, images, things like that as well? But we want you to be thinking about that process. Take some time to level up every single day. And with that said, we will see you guys next time. Thanks.
Bye.